Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep into some fascinating data.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, we've got this 2017 statistical report for Abu Dhabi, and it's chock full of insights about, well, electricity and water.
Two are pretty essential things.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
And our goal today, well, it's to kind of sift through all these numbers and pull out the really interesting stuff, like the big trends and figures that give us a snapshot of what was going on with Abu Dhabi's power and water back in 2017.
Right. So it's less about drowning in data and more about getting a clear picture.
Exactly, like
Yeah.
a highlight reel of the most important insights.
Okay, like that.
So let's start with electricity. The report, it actually gives us a really cool overview of the entire electricity system network as of summer 2018. So it kind of sets the stage, for the year we're focusing on.
Got it. So the infrastructure at that time.
Right, exactly. And then what's interesting is they also show us the weekly electricity peaks.
Weekly peaks. Okay.
Yeah, from 1999 all the way to 2017. And what you see is, well, it's a pretty steady climb in those peak demands over those years.
Makes sense. I mean, considering how much Abu Dhabi was growing and developing during that time.
Right, totally. And then they go on to break down the global Abu Dhabi system's peak and minimum demands between 1999 and 2017. So like the highest and lowest points of electricity consumption.
Okay, yeah. So like the range.
And the ratio between those figures, that's actually pretty telling.
Yeah, because a high ratio would suggest, well, a fairly stable demand throughout the year.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's low, then that kind of hints at big swings between the times of highest and lowest use.
And why does that matter?
Well, think about it this way.
Yeah.
If the peak demand is way, way higher than the minimum, you need a lot of extra power generation capacity that might not be used for a good chunk of the year.
Right. It's all about balancing supply and demand.
Right.
Making sure there's enough power when it's needed most.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we get to the 2017 system load duration curves, which I know might sound a little bit jargony,
A bit.
but essentially it's a way of visualizing how often different levels of electricity demand happen throughout the year. So it gives you a sense of the typical demand pattern.
Like a visual representation of the ups and downs over the entire year.
Exactly. And if you then compare like the Abu Dhabi 2017 system electricity demand profiles, specifically between the maximum and minimum months,
Which we...
August and January,
Oh, okay, yeah. Hottest versus coldest.
you see a pretty big difference. I mean,
Yeah.
no surprise, right? August has way higher demand.
I mean, that's scorching summer heat. Got to keep those ACs cranking, right?
Totally. And that's a key takeaway here, right? That August demand being so much higher than the annual average. Well, it just underscores how much air conditioning impacts the electricity grid during those really hot months.
Huge implications for energy planning in a region like that.
Right. So the peak annual demand in 2017, it hit this figure in gross MW. Gross MW, so that's a megawatts.
Yeah, megawatts,
Uh-huh.
which is a measure of electrical power. And the minimum annual demand was, well, quite a bit lower. And as we kind of already touched on, the peak happened in August.
Again, summer heat.
And the minimum, well, that probably occurred sometime during the cooler months when there's less need for, well, both AC and heating.
Yeah, most likely January or February in that climate.
Makes sense. And then the report gets even more granular, and it gives us the peak and minimum monthly demands from 2012 to 2017.
Okay.
And what's cool is when you look at these figures, you can start to spot these annual patterns.
Like what?
Well, you see those summer months. They always have those higher peaks
Yeah.
year after year.
Makes sense.
And the report highlights this ratio, the ratio of the monthly peak demand to the annual peak.
Uh-huh.
And that basically shows how much the demand goes up and down within a year relative to the absolute highest point.
I see.
And this is really important for, operational planning and keeping that electricity grid stable. Got it. Making sure the lights stay on even when demand is surging.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the total amount of energy used. The annual energy demand in 2017, that's presented in gross GWH.
Gross GWH, gigawatt hours.
Yeah, gigawatt hours. And that measures the total electrical energy consumed over time. And it was a pretty big number.
I bet.
But when you break it down further, into monthly energy demand from 2012 to 2017, and then you look at the ratio of that monthly demand to the annual peak demand in 2017, you get this really interesting picture.
Oh, what?
Well, of the seasonal energy consumption habits, like how much energy they're using in different months.
Fascinating stuff.
And then, it's really interesting to compare that to how much electricity was actually being generated, the annual electricity generation in gross kilowatt.
Kilowatt hours.
Yeah.
Another way to measure electrical energy.
Right. And looking at that data from 2012 to 2017, well, it shows us if they were keeping up with that rising demand that we just talked about.
Well, were they producing enough power to meet those needs?
Yeah. And then they go on to break down the annual electricity generation by region from 1999 to 2017. And that's really cool because you can see how different areas contributed to the overall power supply over time.
Interesting. So you can see if there were any shifts in where the electricity was coming from?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe some regions were developing more power plants or, experiencing population growth, and then they break it down even further by company.
By company.
Yeah, they show the annual electricity generation by each company from, get this, 1999 to 2017.
Wow, it's a long period.
It is, and it really highlights who the big players were in the electricity generation sector and how much each company was producing over those years.
So you can kind of track the evolution of the energy market.
Right, exactly. And then we get a breakdown of the energy generation by type of generator. This is for 2017. And they show it both in gross GWH and as a percentage of the total. And this is key because it shows us Abu Dhabi's energy mix. Like, where was their electricity coming from? Was it mostly gas-fired power plants? Or were there other significant sources like solar or other renewables?
Yeah, really paints a picture of their energy portfolio.
Okay, and then the report, it even mentions the annual auxiliary electricity consumption.
Auxiliary.
Yeah, this is basically the electricity that's used to run the power plants themselves.
Oh, okay. So like the internal power consumption of the plants.
Exactly. It's for things like, lights and pumps and all those operational needs within the power plant.
Interesting. So it's like the power plant using a portion of its own generated electricity just to keep running.
Right, exactly. It's important to factor that in when you're looking at the overall efficiency,
Makes sense. If the auxiliary consumption is high, that means less of the generated power is actually available for homes and businesses.
Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about electricity exports and imports.
Okay, cross-border electricity flows.
The report, it gives us the numbers for both annual and monthly exports and imports.
Measured in.
MWH, megawatt hours.
Got it.
From 2012 to 2017.
Okay.
And this shows us how much Abu Dhabi was trading electricity with its neighbors.
I see. So it highlights how interconnected the regional power grid is.
Exactly. And understanding those electricity flows, well, it's super important for making sure there's enough energy security across the whole region and for optimizing, the use of those available power resources in different areas.
Makes sense.
Okay, so one last thing on electricity. We go back to those weekly electricity peak demands.
Okay.
From 1999 to 2017.
Okay.
They show it in MW and as a percentage of the annual peak. And when you look at this data over such a long period, almost 2 decades, you can really start to see if there are any consistent weekly patterns. Like, are there certain days of the week where the demand for electricity is always higher?
Interesting. And I guess any big deviations from those typical patterns could suggest like special events or maybe changes in how people are using electricity.
Right.
Even the impact of holidays over time.
Exactly. Okay, now let's dive into the water data.
All right, let's get wet.
All right. So, just like with electricity, we get an overview of the water system network as of summer 2018. So it gives us a picture of, the whole infrastructure for water production and distribution.
Got it. Setting the scene for the water landscape.
Exactly. Then we see the annual water production, and it's broken down by company and even by individual station, all the way from 1999 to 2017. So we can really identify the major players and the specific facilities that were, in charge of producing water over that time.
Makes sense.
Then they break it down even further. They give us the annual water production by region and the average daily production per region.
Measured in.
MGD, million gallons per day.
Okay, got it.
And that gives us this, geographical view of water production.
So you can see if some areas were pumping out way more water than others.
Right, exactly. And then to add another layer, they show the monthly water production by region from 2012 to 2017.
Okay.
And this helps us understand those seasonal variations.
Right, because some months might see a spike in production due to things like, agriculture or maybe a surge in tourism.
Exactly. Okay. And then the report, it digs into the annual water supply by company from 1999 to 2017, and then by region from 2005 to 2017.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that the water supply, that might not always be exactly the same as the amount of water produced.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. You have things like leakage in the pipes or evaporation.
Right, of course.
So by comparing those figures for water production and supply, we can actually get some insights into how efficient that whole water distribution network is, and maybe even see where those water losses are most significant.
That's a really good point.
Last but not least on water, we have the monthly water supply by company from 2012 to 2017. And this level of detail, it's really helpful. Well, it can reveal these interesting monthly fluctuations, in how much water each company is supplying, maybe due to maintenance work or changes in demand from their customers.
Yeah, he gives those water companies a really valuable tool to manage their operations effectively.
And make sure that water supply is consistent and reliable, year-round.
Absolutely critical.
Okay, let's move on to fuel and capacity. Now, the report gives us this overview of the main gas supply network
Okay.
as of the end of 2018.
Okay.
But specifically, it's excluding connections to plants that have been retired.
I see.
So decommissioned power plants. And this is helpful because it shows us the fuel infrastructure that supports a lot of that power generation.
Right, like a map of how the fuel gets to where it's needed.
Exactly. And then we get to the annual fuel consumption.
Yeah.
And they break it down by company and by fuel type.
Measured in
MB2.
million British thermal units.
Yeah. And this basically tells us who the biggest fuel consumers were
Okay.
and what mix of fuels they were relying on.
Which, in that region, I'd guess would be mostly natural gas, right?
Yeah, you got it. Then we get even more detail. They show the annual fuel consumption by station from 1999 to 2017,
Okay.
and the percentage of annual fuel consumption by each fuel type.
So you can see how the fuel mix evolved over time.
Exactly. We can see which specific facilities were using the most fuel and, how that overall fuel mix was changing.
Makes sense.
And then they break it down even further by month.
Monthly fuel consumption.
Yeah, by the fuel providers from 2007 to 2017.
Wow.
So it gives us this really granular picture of the whole fuel supply chain.
Interesting.
Okay, now let's look at capacity.
Okay.
They give us the total electricity generation capacity in gross NBU.
Megawatts.
Yeah. And the total desalination capacity in gross MGD as of December 31st each year.
So like a snapshot of their capacity at the end of each year?
Exactly. It shows what they had available.
I see.
And then they go deeper into that electricity generation capacity, breaking it down by the specific technology used and by the type of prime mover.
Prime mover.
Yeah, like things like, gas turbines or steam turbines.
Okay.
And this data spans from 1999 to 2018. So we can see how they were generating power, specifically the capacity they had available during peak demand, and how that was changing over the years.
Interesting. You can track the evolution of the technologies they were using to meet those electricity needs.
Exactly. They do the same thing for desalination capacity, breaking it down by different technologies like multi-stage flash distillation or reverse osmosis, again, focusing on that available capacity at peak demand from 1999 to 2018.
So you can see how they were keeping up with the demand for fresh water and how the methods, for producing fresh water have changed over time.
Right. And having this long-term perspective on both the power generation and the desalination capacity, well, it's crucial for understanding how they were planning, how Abu Dhabi was strategically planning to meet those growing needs for both electricity and water.
Makes sense. It's all about planning for the future, especially in a region facing those kinds of challenges.
Okay, now briefly, the report also gives us some data on CO2 emissions.
Emissions, okay.
Calculated using the Emission Intensity Calculation Tool.
Yeah.
And it gives us a sense of, the environmental impact associated with all of this electricity and water production.
Yeah, important to consider the environmental footprint.
And last but not least, the report gives us some forecasts.
Forecasts for what?
For peak electricity demand in gross MW.
Okay.
And peak water demand in gross MGD, looking ahead from 2017.
So projections for the future.
Yeah. And those are really important for, making decisions about infrastructure development and investments in those sectors.
Absolutely. You got to know what's coming down the pike to plan effectively.
So there you have it, our deep dive into the 2017 stats for Abu Dhabi's electricity and water. What stands out to me is, first, that steady increase in demand for both in the years leading up to 2017.
Yeah. Not surprising considering how much the region was developing. Plus, you have the climate to factor in.
Totally. And it's clear that thermal power generation was still playing a big role in electricity production. Plus, that growing desalination capacity, well, that just highlights how important it is to secure those freshwater resources, especially in an environment like that.
Right, where water scarcity is a constant concern.
And then when we look at those fluctuations in demand, those big summer peaks for electricity because of all the AC use,
Yeah.
and the differences in water production across regions, probably influenced by things like agriculture, it really makes you appreciate the complexity of managing those resources in such a dynamic environment.
It's a juggling act for sure.
Yeah, it is. And then we saw how interconnected that power grid is and how reliant they were on natural gas. All those things are key takeaways here.
Absolutely. A lot of moving pieces in that system.
So here's a thought for you, for everyone listening. Knowing all of this about 2017, how do you think Abu Dhabi's energy and water sectors have changed since then? What new technologies, like maybe advancements in renewable energy or even more efficient desalination methods, or even just, changing priorities around sustainability, how do you think those things have reshaped the trends that we've looked at today?
It's a fascinating question to think about.
It is. A lot has happened in the world of energy and water since 2017.
A lot has happened, yeah. And as that global focus on, sustainable resource management keeps getting stronger, well, it makes you wonder, what's next? What's the future hold?
Yeah. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.